My wealthy aunt said I was an embarrassment to the family. What she didn't know was that I had been secretly funding her entire lifestyle since my parents died. At 34, I discovered that the people who called me a failure had been living off my success for 7 years. What happened next changed everything I believed about family, loyalty, and the true cost of keeping quiet. You know that feeling when you walk into a room and the conversation suddenly stops? When you catch that split second of guilty silence before everyone starts talking a little too loudly about the weather. I lived with that feeling for 7 years. Every family gathering, every holiday dinner, every casual Sunday visit to my Aunt Catherine's house felt like walking into a courtroom where I was both the accused and the evidence. My name is Christopher, and this is the story of how I learned that sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are the ones bleeding you dry with the deepest gratitude. Let me take you back to where this all began. 7 years ago, my world shattered in the span of a phone call. My parents, Margaret and Thomas, were driving home from their anniversary dinner when a drunk driver ran a red light. The doctors said they didn't suffer. I've held on to that small mercy through everything that followed. At 27, I found myself the sole inheritor of my parents' carefully built legacy. A modest but well-maintained home in Riverside Heights, a savings account that spoke to decades of disciplined living, and most importantly, a meticulously crafted trust fund designed to support our extended family during genuine emergencies. My father had been a senior project manager at Boeing, my mother a head nurse at Riverside General. They understood the value of preparation, the importance of family, and the delicate balance between helping and enabling. What they couldn't have prepared for was how their generosity would become the foundation for my own family's cruelest joke. My Aunt Catherine, 55 and sharp as a blade when it came to other people's business, became the unofficial matriarch after my parents passed. Her husband, Uncle Richard, 61 and possessed of the kind of confidence that comes from never having been truly challenged, owned a small but successful auto parts distributorship. Their sons, my cousins Derek and Nathan, 29 and 27 respectively, had inherited their parents' sense of entitlement without any of their work ethic. The trust my parents established was supposed to be temporary assistance during life's unexpected storms. Medical emergencies, job loss, educational expenses, genuine hardship. What it became was a 7-year subscription to a lifestyle none of them could actually afford. Here's what haunted me the most. They thought it was government money. Some kind of survivor's benefit program that kicked in after my parents' accident. I never corrected them because in those early days of grief, it felt easier to let them believe whatever helped them sleep at night. I was drowning in my own sorrow, and managing their assumptions felt like a luxury I couldn't afford. But as months turned to years, and grief gave way to a different kind of understanding, I began to see the true cost of my silence. Every month, like clockwork, the payments went out. $1,750 toward their mortgage on that 4-bedroom colonial in Maple Ridge, a neighborhood they couldn't afford on Richard's actual income. $320 for Richard's membership at Ridgeview Country Club, where he spent most Wednesday afternoons practicing his golf swing and most Thursday mornings bragging about his business connections. $560 for Derek's BMW lease, $480 for Nathan's Audi. Credit card payments that averaged $800 monthly, covering everything from Catherine's weekly spa appointments to the family's annual ski trip to Aspen. I kept meticulous records. My father had taught me that money without documentation was just wishful thinking. Every payment, every transfer, every expense was logged, categorized, and filed. I told myself I was honoring their memory by continuing their generosity. What I was really doing was buying myself a front row seat to my own humiliation. The worst part wasn't the money. It was the way they looked at me during family gatherings, with that mixture of pity and superiority that only comes from people who believe they're fundamentally better than you. Catherine would pat my shoulder with the kind of condescending affection you'd show a pet that wasn't quite house-trained. Richard would offer unsolicited advice about building wealth and making smart investments, as if my 10-year-old Honda Civic was evidence of some moral failing, rather than a conscious choice to live below my means. My cousins were even worse. Derek, who worked part-time at a gym and spent most of his energy crafting the perfect Instagram presence, would joke about my vintage clothing and retro lifestyle. Nathan, who whose idea of career advancement was asking his father for a promotion at the family business, once told his girlfriend at Thanksgiving dinner that I was the family cautionary tale about what happens when you don't apply yourself. I absorbed it all in silence, watching them toast their good fortune with wine I'd paid for, in a house I was keeping afloat, wearing clothes and jewelry that my money had made possible. They were living a lie, and I was the one paying for the privilege of being mocked for my honesty. The breaking point came on a Sunday in late September, exactly 7 years and 3 months after my parents' funeral. Catherine had invited me for what she called a family meeting, though the air quotes she made with her fingers should have warned me that this wasn't going to be the supportive conversation I'd naively hoped for. I arrived at 6:30 sharp, carrying a homemade apple crumble made from my mother's recipe. The kitchen was filled with the aroma of Catherine's signature pot roast, the same meal she'd been serving at family gatherings for as long as I could remember. What I didn't know then was that this would be the last time I'd ever smell that particular combination of herbs and disappointment. The dining room table was set with the good china, the pieces my parents had given Catherine for her 25th wedding anniversary. Derek was showing off his new Apple Watch to Nathan, who was pretending to care while scrolling through something on his phone. Richard was at the head of the table, cutting the roast with the kind of ceremonial precision he brought to everything he considered important. The conversation started innocuously enough. Derek mentioned his plans to take a solo trip to Thailand, a spiritual journey he'd been planning since his latest meditation app had suggested he needed to find himself. Nathan talked about the new apartment he was considering in downtown Seattle, something with a view of the waterfront and a monthly rent that exceeded most people's mortgage payments. Catherine dominated the discussion with updates about her book club, her yoga instructor, and her ongoing campaign to convince the Homeowners Association to install a new tennis court. I sat there quietly, eating food I had indirectly purchased, listening to plans I was unknowingly funding, surrounded by people who considered my presence an act of charity on their part. Then Catherine turned to me with that smile I'd learned to dread, the one that meant she was about to say something she considered helpful, but that would leave me feeling smaller than when the conversation started. "Christopher, honey," she began, her voice carrying that particular tone of concern that always felt like criticism wearing a disguise. "Richard and I have been talking, and we really think it's time you started making some changes in your life." The room got quiet in that way that meant everyone had been discussing this before I arrived. Derek stopped playing with his watch. Nathan actually looked up from his phone. Richard set down his carving knife and leaned back in his chair with the satisfaction of a man about to deliver wisdom he considered long overdue. "What kind of changes?" I asked, though part of me already knew where this was heading. "Well," Catherine continued, gesturing around the room as if the evidence of my failures was displayed on the walls, "look at yourself. You're 34 years old, driving a car that's older than some of our neighbors' children, living in that tiny apartment downtown, wearing the same 3 outfits to every family function. Your father and mother would be heartbroken to see how you've let yourself go." The casual cruelty of invoking my parents' disappointment hit me like a physical blow, but I kept my expression neutral. 7 years of practice had taught me to absorb these moments without flinching, though something deep in my chest was beginning to crack. "Christopher," Richard added, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never been contradicted. "At your age, I own 2 businesses and a house in the suburbs. I understand that not everyone has the same drive or natural business instincts, but you have to start somewhere. Maybe it's time to consider getting a real job, something with advancement potential." I wanted to tell him that I had a real job, that my position as a senior financial analyst at Pierce and Associates paid me more than his auto parts business netted in most quarters, that my tiny downtown apartment was a deliberate choice, not a financial limitation, that my old Honda ran perfectly and was completely paid off, unlike the lease payments I was covering for his son's luxury vehicles. Instead, I took another bite of pot roast and waited for the lecture to continue. "The thing is," Derek chimed in, and I could hear the rehearsed quality in his voice that meant this intervention had been planned in advance, "we're all doing really well right now. Dad's business is expanding. Nathan's about to get promoted. I'm launching my wellness coaching practice. We're thinking about taking a family investment trip to Europe next spring. Maybe look at some property opportunities in Tuscany." Nathan nodded enthusiastically. "The whole family, except—" He paused, glancing at his mother for permission to continue. Catherine gave him an almost imperceptible nod. "Well, except it might be kind of awkward having you there, you know? The hotels we're looking at, the restaurants, the business meetings. We don't want you to feel out of place. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire I hadn't seen coming. They were uninviting me from a family vacation that I was, unknowingly, going to finance. The irony was so perfect it almost felt like performance art. Catherine reached across the table and patted my hand with the kind of gentle condescension usually reserved for elderly relatives who'd started repeating themselves. We love you, Christopher. You're family, and family looks out for each other. But sometimes love means telling difficult truths. You're 34 years old, and you're living like you're 22. It's time to grow up. Richard leaned forward, preparing to deliver what he clearly considered the wisdom that would finally motivate me to change my ways. Your parents worked hard their whole lives to build something meaningful. They owned property. They invested wisely. They understood that success requires sacrifice and planning. They'd want you to honor their memory by becoming the kind of man they raised you to be. The reference to my parents' hard work and wise investments sent something cold through my veins. They had indeed worked hard. They had invested wisely. And their greatest investment had been in the trust that was currently subsidizing the lifestyle of the people lecturing me about financial responsibility. You know what your problem is, Christopher? Catherine continued, warming to her theme. You're too comfortable with mediocrity. You've accepted being average, and that's a choice that affects everyone around you. When we're at the country club, or when Richard's business associates ask about family, it's honestly embarrassing to explain why my nephew drives a car like that and lives the way you do. Derek nodded sagely, as if his mother had just revealed a profound truth about the nature of success and failure. It's like you've given up on yourself, man. I mean, look at us. We're all thriving, building something, contributing to society. You're just existing. Nathan, emboldened by his brother's observation, decided to add his own insight. Maybe you need to consider that your parents' accident was supposed to be a wake-up call. Like, life is short, you know? You should be using that lesson to motivate yourself, not as an excuse to settle for less. The room fell silent after Nathan's comment, and I could see in their faces that even they realized he'd crossed a line. But nobody corrected him. Nobody suggested that using my parents' death as a motivational tool might be inappropriate. They just sat there, waiting to see how I'd respond to having my deepest trauma repurposed as evidence of my personal failings. I stood up slowly, placed my napkin beside my plate, and looked around the table at these people who'd spent 7 years living off my generosity while constructing elaborate theories about my inadequacy. Thank you for dinner, I said quietly. And thank you for sharing your thoughts about my life. I'll definitely give them the consideration they deserve. Catherine smiled, clearly pleased that her intervention had been received so graciously. Of course, honey. That's what family is for. We just want to see you reach your potential. I walked to the coat closet, retrieved my jacket, and headed toward the front door. As I was putting on my shoes, I could hear them in the dining room, already moving on to other topics, pleased with themselves for having performed their familial duty of setting me straight. Derek was telling Nathan about a new protein supplement that was supposed to optimize cognitive function. Catherine was asking Richard if he'd remembered to book their couple's massage for the following weekend. Nathan was reading aloud from an article about sustainable investing that he'd found on his phone. They were already spending tomorrow's trust fund payment in their minds, comfortable in the knowledge that their financial security was guaranteed by forces beyond their understanding or control. I stood in their foyer for a moment, surrounded by furniture my money had helped purchase, looking at family photos that included my parents alongside the people who'd just finished explaining why my parents would be disappointed in the man I'd become. Then I took out my phone and called my financial advisor. Marcus, it's Christopher. I know it's Sunday evening, but I need to schedule a meeting first thing tomorrow morning. We need to discuss the family trust. The next morning, I sat in Marcus Wellington's office overlooking the Seattle waterfront, surrounded by the kind of understated luxury that comes from managing other people's money successfully for 3 decades. Marcus had been my father's advisor since before I was born, and he'd helped set up the trust with the meticulous attention to detail that had characterized my parents' approach to everything important. Christopher, he said, reviewing the file he'd prepared for our meeting, I have to say, your parents would be impressed by how you've managed this trust. 7 years of consistent support, every payment documented, every expense justified. You've been more generous than the original parameters required. I looked out at Elliott Bay, watching the morning ferry traffic that carried commuters between their comfortable lives and their productive work, and felt a clarity I hadn't experienced in years. Marcus, I want to understand exactly what my options are. The trust my parents established, what kind of control do I have over distribution decisions? He opened the trust documents, pages my father had reviewed countless times before signing, and walked me through the specifics. As the primary beneficiary and trust administrator, I had considerable discretion over when and how distributions were made. The trust had been designed to provide temporary assistance during genuine emergencies or life transitions, not to fund a permanent lifestyle upgrade for extended family members. Your parents were very specific about the purpose, Marcus explained, pointing to a highlighted section in the original documentation. They wanted to help family members during periods of legitimate hardship, with the expectation that assistance would be temporary and would help recipients achieve greater independence, not permanent dependence. I thought about Derek's meditation retreat to Thailand and Nathan's waterfront apartment hunt. I considered Catherine's book club lunches and Richard's golf club networking sessions. None of these qualified as temporary hardship or steps toward greater independence. What would happen if I decided to modify the distribution schedule? I asked. Marcus leaned back in his chair, a gesture I recognized from meetings with my father. He was about to deliver information that required careful consideration. You have the authority to reduce, suspend, or terminate distributions at any time, provided you can demonstrate that the original purpose of the trust is not being served. Given the documentation you've maintained over the past 7 years and the current financial stability of the recipients, you'd be well within your rights to modify the arrangement. We spent the next 2 hours reviewing every aspect of the trust, every payment I'd authorized, every expense I'd covered. The total was staggering. Over 7 years, I'd distributed nearly $400,000 to support a lifestyle my relatives had convinced themselves they'd earned through their own efforts. There's something else you should know, Marcus said as our meeting was wrapping up. Your parents included a provision that might be relevant to your current situation. If at any point you determined that trust distributions were being used in ways that contradicted their intent, you were authorized to require full disclosure of recipients' financial situations before continuing support. He handed me a document I'd never seen before, a letter my father had written and sealed, to be opened only if I ever questioned whether the trust was serving its intended purpose. Christopher, if you're reading this, it means you've reached a point where the generosity we hope to extend to our family has become a burden rather than a blessing. Your mother and I always worried that our desire to help might inadvertently harm the people we love most, either by creating dependency or by enabling them to avoid the growth that comes from facing challenges independently. We trusted you to make these difficult decisions because we raised you to understand that love sometimes requires saying no. If you determine that our financial support is preventing your aunt, uncle, and cousins from becoming the self-reliant, responsible adults we know they can be, then you have not just our permission, but our blessing to modify or end that support. The money was meant to be a bridge during difficult times, not a permanent foundation for avoiding difficulty altogether. We trust your judgment completely, and we know that whatever decision you make will be motivated by the same love that motivated our original generosity. Remember that the most important gift we can give anyone is the opportunity to discover their own strength, and sometimes the discovery requires facing challenges without a safety net they've forgotten they're using. I sat in that office, holding my father's words and looking out at a city where thousands of people were working to build lives they could sustain with their own efforts, and felt something shift inside me that had been building for 7 years. That afternoon, I began the process of drafting formal notices to Catherine, Richard, Derek, and Nathan. The language was careful, professional, and gave them 60 days to arrange alternative financing for the mortgages, car payments, credit cards, and lifestyle expenses that had become dependent on trust distributions. I also arranged for a detailed accounting to be prepared, showing exactly how much money had been distributed over the past 7 years, and for what purposes. They were about to discover that their government assistance program was actually their nephew's inheritance, and that their nephew was considerably more financially sophisticated than they'd assumed. The notices went out on a Thursday morning. By Thursday afternoon, my phone was ringing constantly. Catherine was the first to call, her voice a mixture of confusion and rising panic. "Christopher, honey, we just received some very strange paperwork. There seems to be some kind of mix-up about the house payments. Could you come over tonight so we can figure this out together?" I let the call go to voicemail. Richard called an hour later, his tone carrying the authority of someone who expected immediate answers to urgent questions. Christopher, we need to talk right away. There's been some kind of administrative error with our financial assistance, and we need your help resolving it before it affects our credit. Derek's message was shorter, but more revealing. Dude, what's going on with this trust thing? Are you like rich or something? Call me back. Nathan's voicemail was pure panic. Christopher, please call me back immediately. There's been some huge mistake about our car payments, and I'm supposed to start my new job on Monday, and I need my car, and I don't understand what's happening. I listened to each message twice, hearing the growing realization in their voices that their comfortable world was built on a foundation they'd never bothered to examine. That evening, I drove to Catherine's house for what I knew would be our final family dinner. The October air was crisp with the promise of winter, and the leaves on the maple trees that lined their street were just beginning to turn the colors that would soon cover the ground in preparation for the dormant season ahead. I parked my Honda in their driveway, behind Derek's BMW and next to Nathan's Audi, and walked to the front door carrying a bottle of wine that I'd purchased with my own money, from my own budget, without any assistance from trusts or government programs or anyone else's generosity. Catherine answered the door before I could knock, her face flushed with the kind of emotional intensity that comes from spending an entire day trying to solve a problem you don't fully understand. Christopher, thank goodness you're here. We've been trying to reach you all day. Something terrible has happened with the assistance program, and we need your help figuring out what to do. I followed her into the living room, where Richard was pacing behind the couch with a stack of papers in his hand. Derek was slouched in the corner chair with his laptop open, and Nathan was sitting at the dining room table with his head in his hands. This is insane, Richard was saying as I entered the room. 7 years of payments, and now they're telling us it was some kind of trust? That doesn't make any sense. Christopher, you handle administrative stuff well. Can you help us figure out who we need to call to fix this? I sat down in the chair my father used to occupy during family gatherings, the one with the best view of the entire room, and looked at each of them carefully. There's nothing to fix, I said quietly. And there's no administrative error. The assistance you've been receiving for the past 7 years has been coming from the trust my parents established before they died. I've been the one authorizing every payment, covering every expense, supporting every aspect of your lifestyle that you couldn't actually afford on your own. The room went completely silent. Derek's laptop made a small chiming sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. Nathan looked up from his hands with an expression I'd never seen before, something between confusion and the dawning recognition of a truth he didn't want to accept. Catherine was the first to speak, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. That's not possible. The government program. They told us. Who told you? I asked. When you applied for assistance after my parents died, who exactly did you speak with? What paperwork did you fill out? What office did you visit? Richard stopped pacing and turned to face me, his face cycling through several different emotions as he tried to process what I was telling him. You're saying that you've been paying 70% of your mortgage, covering Richard's golf club membership, financing Derek's BMW lease and Nathan's Audi payments, managing your credit card bills, your utility expenses, your vacation costs, your kitchen renovation, your spa appointments, your ski trips, your dinner bills, your emergency expenses. I pulled out my phone and opened the banking app that contained 7 years of meticulously documented financial transfers. $437,862. That's how much of my inheritance has gone to supporting your lifestyle, while you've spent 7 years explaining to me why I'm a disappointment to my parents' memory. Derek closed his laptop with a sharp snap that echoed through the room. This is a joke, right? You're like, I don't know, getting back at us for something. Christopher, you drive a 10-year-old Honda. You live in that tiny apartment. You shop at Target. I drive a paid-off Honda that runs perfectly and requires no monthly payments. I live in an apartment that costs $1,200 a month instead of the $4,000 mortgage payment I've been covering for you. I shop at Target because I learned from my parents that financial security comes from living below your means, not above them. Nathan stood up from the table, his face flushed with something that looked like anger but might have been embarrassment. So what? You've been lying to us for 7 years. Pretending to be broke while you're actually loaded? I've never lied to you about anything. You assumed I was broke because I don't waste money on status symbols. You created a story about government assistance because it was easier than asking questions about where the money was actually coming from. I never corrected your assumptions because I was grieving my parents and trying to honor their wishes to help family during difficult times. Catherine sat down heavily in her chair, the papers from Richard's hands scattered across the coffee table between us. Christopher, honey, if this is true, if you've really been supporting us all these years, why didn't you tell us? Because my parents designed the trust to provide temporary assistance during emergencies, not permanent funding for lifestyle inflation. Because I thought that at some point over the past 7 years, you might express gratitude instead of condescension. Because I hoped that eventually you'd achieve the financial independence that would make continued assistance unnecessary. I stood up and walked to the window that overlooked their backyard, the space where we'd held countless family barbecues and birthday parties, where my parents had played with Derek and Nathan when they were children, where Catherine had hosted the reception after my parents' funeral. Last Sunday, you told me that my parents would be disappointed in the man I'd become. You explained that I was an embarrassment to the family, that my lifestyle reflected poorly on everyone associated with me. You uninvited me from a family vacation that I would have been financing. You used my parents' death as evidence of my personal failures. I turned back to face them, and for the first time in 7 years, I felt like I was the adult in the room. The trust payments end in 60 days. You'll need to arrange your own financing for the mortgage, the cars, the credit cards, and everything else. I've prepared a complete accounting of every dollar that's been distributed, which you'll receive from my attorney along with the formal termination notice. Richard found his voice, though it came out as more of a croak than his usual commanding tone. Christopher, you can't just cut us off. We have obligations, commitments. The mortgage alone. The mortgage that you thought was being covered by a government program you never bothered to research or appreciate. The mortgage on a house you couldn't afford when you bought it and still can't afford now. Catherine stood up, her composure finally cracking completely. We're family. You can't abandon family. Your parents wouldn't want this. I pulled out the letter my father had written, the one I discovered just that morning, and read them the relevant passage about love sometimes requiring the courage to say no. My parents wanted to help you become self-reliant, responsible adults. Instead, I've spent 7 years enabling you to avoid facing the reality of your financial limitations while you convinced yourselves that I was the family failure. Derek was staring at his phone, probably calculating car payments and apartment costs and wondering how he was going to fund his spiritual journey to Thailand without the trust fund he'd never known existed. Nathan was looking around the room as if seeing it for the first time, maybe beginning to understand that the furniture, the decorations, the comfortable suburban lifestyle he'd grown up taking for granted had been subsidized by the cousin he'd been mocking for not achieving enough. What happens to us? Catherine asked quietly. The same thing that happens to millions of families who have to live within their actual means. You'll downsize the house, return the leased cars, cancel the country club membership, and build a lifestyle you can sustain with Richard's business income. Or Richard will expand his business, you'll find employment, Derek and Nathan will contribute to household expenses, and you'll work together to maintain the standard of living you've become accustomed to. I walked toward the front door, pausing to look one more time at the family photos that lined the hallway, images of birthdays and holidays and graduations, moments of genuine happiness that existed alongside the financial deception that had poisoned our relationships for 7 years. For what it's worth, I said, turning back to face them one final time, I hope you succeed. I hope you find a way to build something sustainable and meaningful with your own efforts. I hope you discover that the pride that comes from genuine accomplishment feels better than the artificial comfort that comes from someone else's sacrifice. Catherine followed me to the door, tears streaming down her face, her voice breaking as she spoke. Christopher, please. We can change. We can do better. Just give us another chance. You have 60 days to prove that, I replied. Not to me, but to yourselves. I drove home through neighborhoods filled with families living lives they'd earned through their own work and sacrifice. People who understood the connection between effort and reward, between choices and consequences. The autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke from fireplaces being lit for the first time since spring, a reminder that seasons change and that survival requires preparation, adaptation, and the wisdom to distinguish between what we want and what we can afford. The next morning, I woke up in my $1,200 apartment, made coffee with beans I'd purchased with money I'd earned at my job, and felt lighter than I had in 7 years. My phone had 17 missed calls and 43 text messages, ranging from desperate pleas to angry accusations to promises of family reconciliation if I would just reconsider my decision. I deleted them all without reading them completely. Instead, I called Marcus Wellington and set up an appointment to discuss establishing the scholarship fund my parents would have supported, a way to help young people who understood the value of education and hard work but lacked the financial resources to pursue their goals. I also called a realtor about my parents' house, the modest home where I'd learned about integrity, responsibility, and the difference between helping people and enabling them. I'd been renting it to tenants for 7 years, but I was ready to move back to the neighborhood where I'd learned that true wealth comes not from how much you can spend, but from how much you can give without expecting anything in return. 3 months later, I drove past Catherine and Richard's house and saw a for sale sign in the front yard. Derek's BMW was gone, replaced by a 5-year-old Toyota Camry. Nathan's Audi had also disappeared, though I didn't see any replacement vehicle in the driveway. I felt neither satisfaction nor regret at this evidence that they were adapting to their new financial reality. What I felt was something closer to relief, the sense that a long and complicated chapter of my life had finally reached its natural conclusion. My parents had taught me that love without boundaries becomes enabling, and that the greatest gift you can give someone is the opportunity to discover their own strength. It had taken me 7 years to find the courage to apply that lesson to my own family, but I'd finally learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is step back and let people face the consequences of their choices. The scholarship fund has helped 18 students in its first year, young people who understand that opportunity is earned through effort and that success requires the willingness to live below your means while working towards something larger than immediate gratification. I never heard from Catherine, Richard, Derek, or Nathan again, though I occasionally wondered whether they'd found a way to build something sustainable from the ruins of their subsidized lifestyle. I hoped they had, not because I felt any obligation to their happiness, but because I knew my parents would have wanted them to discover the satisfaction that comes from genuine accomplishment. As for me, I learned that integrity isn't about being perfect, but about being honest about your limitations and generous within your means. I learned that family isn't defined by blood relation, but by mutual respect and genuine care for each other's well-being. And I learned that the most important inheritance my parents left me wasn't money, but the wisdom to know when generosity serves love and when it serves something else entirely. Sometimes the people who call you a failure are living off your success. Sometimes the family that claims to love you most is the one taking the greatest advantage of your loyalty. And sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is stop protecting people from the natural consequences of their choices and give them the opportunity to become the strong, independent people they were always capable of being. If you've ever found yourself supporting people who treat your generosity as their entitlement, if you've ever been mocked for your choices by people whose lives depend on your sacrifice, if you've ever wondered whether love requires you to accept disrespect in exchange for the privilege of helping, then maybe this story offers you the same clarity it eventually gave me. You don't owe anyone a lifestyle you're not living yourself. You don't owe anyone the comfort of avoiding consequences they've earned through their choices. And you certainly don't owe anyone the right to treat your kindness as weakness while living off the strength they refuse to acknowledge. The greatest gift you can give to people you love is the chance to discover what they're capable of when they can't depend on your sacrifice to cushion their mistakes. Sometimes the discovery happens through struggle, through downsizing, through the humbling experience of learning to live within actual means rather than imagined ones. But that's not cruelty. That's not abandonment. That's love mature enough to prioritize long-term growth over short-term comfort, wise enough to understand that real security comes from self-reliance rather than dependency, and courageous enough to endure temporary conflict in service of permanent positive change. 7 years taught me that enabling people doesn't help them, it just makes them weaker and you more resentful. 60 days taught them that they were stronger than they'd allowed themselves to become. And the rest of our lives will show whether the lesson was worth the cost of learning it.